Evening, friends. I'm Beau LeClair, and this here's the Dixie Tales, where the Deep South still whispers if you listen close. These are the stories that never made the history books, but live on in the heat, the dust, and the hush between crickets. So pull up a chair, tap that like, and subscribe if you believe some truths are too wild to stay buried. Now, let's begin. They say the bayou keeps its own kind of memory, thicker than blood and meaner than the river. You can bury a man out there and the mud won't tell a soul, but the water will remember every ripple he made. The air too humid, heavy, crawling with old secrets that cling to your skin like sweat. I learned that as a boy sitting on my granddaddy's porch down in Terrebonne Parish, listening to cane frogs growl under the moon, and the slow churn of swamp water shifting like something alive. But nothing taught me that lesson harder than the night I first heard about the Gator Still of Bayou Salem, the place where men went in search of moonshine gold and came home with ghosts behind their eyes. Some never came home at all. Now, before we get tangled in the reeds, let me give you a picture. Imagine a stretch of swamp so thick with fog and rot it feels like stepping into someone else's bad dream. Cypress trees rise like ancient spines from the black water, their limbs draped in Spanish moss that moves even when the air is dead still. The ground is soft, giving under your heel like it's breathing. Dragonflies flicker through the mist like sparks from some unseen fire. And everywhere those eyes watching you. Big, round, yellow ones floating just above the surface, blinking slow, patient, cold. Alligators. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Nobody counted. That place is Bayou Salem, a patch of Louisiana swamp you won't find on maps drawn after 1940. Paper couldn't hold it right, and no surveyor worth his salt dared step inside long enough to chart it. The locals said the water there had a spirit, not a kind one, and that the land around it swallowed sound, swallowed light, and swallowed sinners without so much as a burp. Folks built their homes miles off, and the few who hunted near it always came back quieter than they left, smelling of fear under their sweat. I've seen grown men cross themselves just hearing the name. But during Prohibition, back when the government thought it could wring the sin out of America by taking everyone's liquor, Bayou Salem became something else, something darker, louder, and far more profitable. Because hidden right in the heart of that swamp sat a still unlike any other, a copper rig perched high on a rotted platform, glimmering like a bronze ghost through the trees when the moon caught it right. Smoke rising soft through the branches, disappearing before any revenuers could sniff it. And the liquor that flowed from that rig, folks said it burned like fire and went down smooth as grace. They called it white lightning of the devil's throat, a name earned honest. One sip could set a preacher's bones buzzing and make a sinner forget every promise he swore before dawn. It was said to be the strongest shine in all the South, and people drove from 3 states over just to buy a mason jar. But it wasn't the shine that made the still famous. It was its guardian. See, the man who ran the place wasn't just any bootlegger. He was a wiry old Cajun named Remy Boudreaux, born on a shrimp boat, baptized in river water, raised by a grandmother who believed charms worked better than doctors. Remy grew up learning to trap, fish, and disappear. He knew every whisper the swamp made and could read its moods better than most men read scripture. Folks said he rarely spoke above a murmur and didn't bother with friends because the swamp kept better company anyway. But the one thing he did love was moonshine, making it, selling it, drinking it, living off its fire. And he didn't guard that shine with guns. He guarded it with a beast. A 14-foot alligator named Thibodeaux, big as a canoe, with a jaw that could snap a man's ribcage like matchsticks. Remy raised him from a hatchling, fed him scraps, trained him like some folks train dogs. If Remy whistled low, that gator slid through, the water like a shadow and surfaced right beside him, eyes burning gold in the dark. And if strangers stepped foot in that water, well, let's just say the swamp didn't give back much in one piece. That's what kept the revenuers away at first. But word spreads quick when money's involved, and soon federal agents started hearing whispers about the Cajun king of Bayou Salem, the man who ran his liquor with the help of a swamp monster. Washington didn't like stories like that. Washington didn't like being laughed at either. So by 1926, the government sent real men to find Remy and shut his still down for good. But the swamp had other plans. Now anyone can make up a ghost story, and Lord knows the South has more than its share. But the Gator Still tale, this one has teeth, names, dates, reports, missing persons, and scars on the lawmen who lived through it. My granddaddy was a young man working riverboats back then, and he said the first time he heard of it was a Sunday morning after church. Folks were whispering by the oak tree outside St. Andrew's Chapel, eyes wide like they'd seen the devil step out the baptismal font. A deputy from Houma, Pete Lemaire, had gone into Bayou Salem with 2 state agents and come out at sunrise alone, shaking so bad they thought he had malaria. His clothes were torn, his boots shredded, and he kept muttering about eyes in the dark, eyes too big to belong to any animal man should cross. When he finally calmed enough to talk, this is what he said. We didn't find the still found us. He told them how the swamp grew silent the moment they entered. No frogs, no birds, not even mosquitoes. Said the air felt wrong, too thick, too warm, and the water rippled even though there was no wind. They followed the smell of smoke, figuring they were close. Then they saw it, a hut on stilts, firelight glowing behind cypress roots, the faint glint of copper through the trees like a star, fallen low. They crept closer, quiet as they could, but before they got within 50 feet, the water broke open. He said it came up like a log, at first long, dark, slow. Then it rolled, tail lashing, jaws opening wide enough to swallow a man whole. One of the agents fired his shotgun and missed. The second didn't get a chance. Pete said the gator moved faster than a shadow in candlelight. There was a splash, a scream that cut too short, and then nothing but bubbles rising between them and the still. The swamp was feeding. Pete ran, crawled, prayed. Whatever got him out, it wasn't skill. He resigned 2 days later and never carried a gun again. Stories like that don't stay buried long. By autumn of 27, folks wouldn't fish within a mile of Bayou Salem. Hunters avoided it like sin. Even the bravest Cajun's men who could wrestle a gator and laugh about it later kept a wide berth. Something lived out there, something old and hungry, and it guarded Remy Boudreaux like a saint guards a church. Now, I ain't saying every detail's gospel truth. Fear exaggerates, memories stretch. But the bones of the story, they're real. Too many disappearances, too many boots found with the toes chewed clean off, too many boats turning up empty, drifting slow as coffins through the cypress. And the law, embarrassed and beaten, started looking for a man who wasn't scared. A man stubborn enough to walk into hell with a Bible in one hand and a badge in the other. They found him in Charleston, a federal agent named Willis Grant. 6'4", stone jaw, steady hand. He'd taken down bootleggers from Savannah to Galveston and carried a scar across his shoulder from a still explosion that almost took his life. Folks said he didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't laugh much either. But he had one weakness. He hated failure. And every time the papers printed a story about that Cajun Gator King, it made his blood boil. He told his boss, "I'll bring him in, alive or dead." Boss said, "Watch the gator." Willis just smirked. And that's how the greatest showdown the Bayou ever saw began. One stubborn lawman, one cunning Cajun, one monster swimming the dark water between them, and a swamp ready to swallow whichever man made the first mistake. But before we get to the night, it all went wrong the night the moon turned red over Bayou Salem, and the air smelled of copper and gunpowder. You need to understand something about the Deep South. We ain't scared of ghosts. We live alongside them. We ain't scared of storms. We build our homes to sway with them. But the swamp is different. It belongs to itself, and when a man decides he can master it well, the swamp always collects its due. The first time Willis Grant stepped off the dock into that water, even the bullfrogs went silent. And that's when he knew, same as you'll know soon enough, that this wasn't just a moonshine story anymore. It was a warning. And the Bayou never gives warnings without reason. Willis Grant stepped off the plank dock at Bayou Terrebonne the way a man steps into a courtroom, stiff-backed, steady-eyed, and already judging the land beneath his feet. He'd been warned 6 times on his way down from Charleston, each warning delivered with the same uneasy tilt of the head, same shift of the eyes toward the cypress horizon. Federal man or no, you ain't meant for that swamp. But Willis wasn't the type to take heed. Pride had carved his jawline deeper than any razor. He believed danger could be beaten with discipline, as if this world ran on rules, not on shadows and blood the way the South did. He tied his boat to an old piling, adjusted his shoulder holster, and set his boots into mud that sucked at the leather like it wanted to taste him. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. Not just ordinary quiet, but the kind that felt engineered, like the swamp was holding its breath, all at once. Even the cicadas hesitated, as though giving space for something older to speak. Willis stood there for a moment, listening, trying to place what felt wrong, because one thing he'd learned in 12 years of chasing bootleggers was this: before a place kills you, it introduces itself. But Bayou Salem didn't introduce itself. It just stared back with black water and waited for him to blink first. He pushed forward, swatting at vines that hung low and heavy like wet ropes. The humidity wrapped around him thick enough to taste copper, moss, stagnant water, the faint rot of something that died a week too long ago. His boots sank deeper the farther he went, mud swallowing each step like a hand pulling him under. Spanish moss brushed his face in long gray fingers. Cypress roots rose from the murk, like skeletal limbs twisted by fever. Every direction looked the same: water, fog, roots, shadows. The bayou had a way of making a man feel lost even before he took a turn. Behind him, the last flicker of town lanterns dimmed, swallowed whole by the tangle of trees. He was alone now, and the swamp made sure he felt it. Willis Grant wasn't a man easily rattled. He'd crawled through burning barns, hunting stills built by men who didn't care whether he came out alive. He'd taken a bullet in the thigh from a moonshiner's wife in Savannah, stitched himself up with fishing line, and still managed to arrest her husband before dawn. But this was different. The land felt aware, sizing him up. He knew the reputation of Bayou Salem, of course. He knew the stories whispered in Charleston barber shops and passed across speakeasy counters. Men vanishing without screams, boats found drifting in circles, the water bubbling as if something down there breathed through the mud. Most stories didn't bother him. This one did. He reached a patch of shallow water that forced him to slow down. Each step sent ripples across the surface, disappearing into dark gaps between tree trunks. He crouched to examine a print in the mud, long, wide, deep. A gator track, but larger than any he'd seen in Georgia or the Carolinas. The claws left furrows that curved inward, heavy and deliberate, almost possessive. Willis pressed his palm beside it and swallowed the first flicker of unease. The track dwarfed his hand by 3 inches. He straightened and scanned the water with a hunter's eye, his breath controlled, movements precise. That's when he heard it, a soft splash behind him, too small for a fallen branch, too careful for chance. He turned slowly, letting the motion of his body announce that he was not afraid. Fear, in his view, was a language he refused to speak. But the swamp spoke it fluently. Something slid through the water 30 yards behind him. The surface bulged, rolled, smoothed. No eyes yet. No snout breaking the light. Just movement. Calculated, patient, gliding a perfect semicircle around him. Willis drew his Colt, but kept it low. Bullets don't mean much in the water. He'd killed gators before, but never in a place where they held the advantage. Full, dark, chest-deep swamp. Footing soft as pudding, he remembered the briefing. The Boudreaux Gator, they called it, though most said the name with a shudder. Thibodeaux, 14 feet long, smart, raised by the bootlegger as if it were kin. Willis didn't believe half of that, not the intelligence part, nor the training, but the size. He believed it now. The water stilled again, and that silence, that breathless, waiting lull, pressed against his ribs until his heart felt too loud in his chest. The swamp wasn't empty. It was full of eyes, full of teeth, full of stories that had lived here centuries before the law had a name. He kept moving, slower now, careful not to splash. His clothes clung to him with sweat, the heat squeezing his lungs like warm hands. Each vine he brushed past left a streak of dew across his shoulder. Mud sucked at his foot until he had to pull upward with both strength and balance. Step by step, the bayou was claiming him. He paused at a fork in the waterway, a narrow channel split 3 ways by cypress knees. All 3 paths looked identical, but the leftmost one carried a thread of smoke curling low against the fog. Not strong, not fresh, but real. He knelt and sniffed the air. Wood smoke mixed with yeast. Corn mash. Something metallic. Copper. His first real sign of Remy Boudreaux. He followed the scent, slipping between trees so close their bark scraped his shoulders. The moon barely reached this far in, filtered through moss and humidity until it had the strength of a dying lantern. The deeper he went, the more the swamp changed. The water grew darker, thicker, turning from murk to ink. The air cooled slightly, the kind of cool that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with things watching from the shadows. Willis tightened his grip on the one, Colt. Up ahead, something clanked. Soft, hollow, metallic. Still a real one, shifting as heat rose from its belly. He crouched behind a root. Moonlight caught on copper sheeting, warped and blackened by years of use. The platform stood on stilts above the water, sagging under its own weight, connected to the trees by rope bridges that swayed in the faint breeze. Barrels stacked beside it, jars lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. A fire pit smoldered low, invisible unless you knew how to look, and there hunched over the mash pot, stirring slow with a long wooden paddle, was Remy Boudreaux himself. Willis had expected a wild, broad-shouldered man with a beard thick enough to hide knives in. But Remy was small, wiry, almost fragile. His hair hung in gray ropes past his shoulders, tied with strips of leather. His bare feet gripped the planks like claws. He wore loose pants, no shirt, his skin weathered by years of sun and swamp air. Beside him, hanging from a nail in one of the stilts, was a carved talisman. Bones bound with string, feathers twisting gently in the humid breeze. Willis felt his pulse settle. Finally, something human. He stepped into the clearing, boots sinking into mud with a thick, sucking sound. Remy didn't look up, just kept stirring, humming a low Cajun song through his teeth. The tune was eerie minor tones, something passed down through generations that remembered French hymns and African drum beats all at once. The melody felt older than the still itself. Willis cleared his throat. Remy Boudreaux. The humming stopped. The paddle froze mid-circle. Remy lifted his head just enough for his eyes to catch the moonlight, too cold, measuring points of gray that did not show surprise, fear, or anger. Only recognition. "I been expectin' you, Cher," Remy said, voice rough as oyster shells. "Swamp told me you was comin'." Willis frowned. "I don't answer to swamps. I answer to federal law." Remy finally turned fully toward him, leaning on the paddle like a cane. "And law don't walk in my water without paying the price." "I'm here to shut you down," Willis said. "Alive if you cooperate, dead if you don't." Remy's smile was small, sad, almost sympathetic. "Dead ain't something you in charge of tonight." A soft ripple broke the surface behind Willis. Slow, heavy, purposeful. Remy's eyes shifted past him. "You stepped in his river, federal man, and he don't like strangers." Willis spun, Colt raised, but saw only black water and the faint outline of something massive gliding just beneath the surface. "Thibodeaux," Remy whispered, pride and warning tangled in the same breath. "He been waiting for you." Willis backed onto a firmer patch of ground, gun steady now. "Call him off." Remy's lids lowered halfway, amused. "You don't call off something born wild. You just pray it had enough supper." A column of water rose 5 feet behind Willis. Not a splash, a rise. A lifting of swamp water displaced by something enormous. Then the moonlight caught the ridges of a jaw. Willis fired. The shot cracked through the swamp like a whip. Something roared beneath the water, not like an animal, but like the swamp itself exhaling. And Remy, cool as a preacher reading a eulogy, said, "You should have done that, Chair." Behind Willis, the water split open, and the night of the Gator Still began. When Willis fired that first shot, the sound rolled through the swamp like a thunderclap trapped under the canopy, rattling moss and shaking loose droplets from the trees. But the echo died too fast, swallowed by the wet air as though the bayou didn't much care for noise made by men. Willis kept his stance steady, the Colt still raised, but the water behind him had changed. It heaved once, slow and heavy, sending waves licking against tree roots. The surface bulged outward as if something too large for that narrow channel was shifting, adjusting itself, deciding what kind of trouble it wanted to make next. Willis felt the vibrations run through the mud beneath his boots, a low tremor like a drumbeat under the earth, steady as a heartbeat and twice as ominous. Remy didn't move from the platform. He set the paddle down with care, never taking his eyes off what was forming behind Willis. The old man's posture carried a strange mix of resignation and pride, the expression of someone who has lived long enough to understand what cannot be stopped and respects it the way others might respect a judge or a priest. Willis turned back toward the water in a slow arc, eyes narrowing to read the shifting shadows. There, inches below the surface, he saw the outline of a skull larger than any gator he had ever encountered. It appeared in patches as the moonlight slid across the ripples, rough scales, raised ridges, a long jaw lined with teeth that flashed pale in the dark like a row of tiny gravestones. The creature didn't surge upward right away. It held itself in that quiet moment, letting its presence seep into Willis's senses, letting him understand the scale of what he had stepped into. Water pushed outward around it, drifting toward the edges of the clearing like a slow tide, and with each pulse the air carried a musky, reptilian smell mixed with the metallic tang of swamp mud. Willis's finger tightened on the trigger again, not to fire, but to remind himself he still had control over something. Yet deep down, even he knew bullets were not the kind of language this beast respected. The gator rose only an inch, exposing its eyes, twin orbs glowing with that eerie swamp fire reflection that made them seem alive with something older than instinct. Willis recognized animal intelligence. But there was something else there too, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand upright. It was the same feeling a man gets when he realizes he is not the hunter anymore. Willis backed toward a cypress trunk, keeping his footing firm, though the mud clung to each boot with greedy suction. His breath slowed into the measured cadence of a man preparing for whatever comes next. But his mind ran through every miscalculation that had brought him this far into a world he didn't understand. Remy finally spoke, his voice drifting across the water in a low drawl. "Cher, when you shoot at a king, you best be sure you meant to kill him." Willis didn't acknowledge the words. He focused on the angle of the creature's body, the way its back arched beneath the water, the slow rise of its tail that hinted at the massive strength coiled beneath the surface. He steadied himself, calculating distance, speed, and how much warning he might get if it lunged. He doubted he'd have much. The gator moved first. It didn't thrash or charge. It glided toward him with deceptive ease, parting the water in a wide V-shaped wake. The movement was deliberate, graceful, almost silent, and that was what made it terrifying. Willis raised the Colt again, this time aiming not in panic but with discipline forged through years of tight corners and close calls. He fired a second shot, and the bullet hit the surface with a hard crack, skidding off the thick hide just above the creature's eye. The gator did not flinch. It simply adjusted its path, continuing its approach without hesitation, a reminder that this was its home, and Willis was the intruder. Willis felt the urgency build inside him, not panic but strategy, the cold surge of survival instinct that had kept him alive through ambushes and bootlegger traps. He pivoted and moved along the bank toward higher roots, trying to gain elevation. The mud fought him, sucking at his feet like the swamp was trying to keep him still for the beast. He reached a thick cluster of roots jutting up like twisted ribs and climbed onto them, gaining just enough height to break the water's reach. Thibodeaux closed the distance between them, sliding under the roots with terrifying ease. The water boiled around Willis's ankles, and he could feel the swell of the gator's massive body pushing upward beneath him. He leapt to another patch of ground, grabbing at vines and pulling himself toward a thicker tree. His pulse hammered in his ears, but his movements stayed controlled, fueled by discipline rather than fear. He He reached solid footing and glanced back just in time to see the gator rear its head, jaws snapping shut where Willis's leg had been seconds earlier. The sound of those jaws clapping together echoed like a rifle shot, a reminder of what kind of force could crush him without effort. Willis steadied himself, trying to find Remy through the tangle of swamp shadows. The old man hadn't fled or hidden. He stood at the edge of his platform, arms crossed, watching the scene with a kind of weary knowledge. He lifted his chin slightly, signaling to Willis with a subtle nod toward the east side of the clearing where the water thinned into reeds. Willis understood immediately that direction offered a chance, not safety, but at least a space narrow enough that Thibodeaux might have difficulty maneuvering. He didn't trust Remy, but he trusted geometry. He ran. The swamp rose up to meet him, reeds brushing against his thighs as he pushed through them, his breathing short and sharp but controlled. Behind him, water surged with violent splashes as Thibodeaux turned and followed. The reeds trembled as the creature plowed through them, splitting the foliage with raw force. Willis moved between trees, using each one as a barrier, as a point to pivot and change direction, giving himself the advantage of tighter turns. The gator was powerful, but not agile. Willis used that, but the swamp had its own loyalties. The ground dipped suddenly into a deep pocket of water hidden under a thin layer of vegetation. Willis stepped down and sank up to his round waist in cold blackness. The shock hit him, but he forced his body calm, pushing through the water, ignoring the way the mud wrapped around his legs. He clawed his way to a fallen log, bracing his hands on the slick bark and hauling himself upward. He could feel the suction of the swamp pulling at him, as if eager to slow him down just long enough for the thing chasing him. Thibodeaux came barreling through the reeds a moment later, water erupting around him. Willis didn't wait to see the next move. He pushed himself along the log, slipping, scrambling, gritting his teeth as bark tore at his palms. The gator rammed the fallen trunk, sending it rocking, nearly tipping Willis back into the water. He held tight, muscles burning, fighting for balance as the log swayed again. The gator's tail lashed sideways, striking the water with a force that sent ripples breaking against the trees. Willis moved forward, inch by relentless inch, until he reached solid ground on the far side. He rolled into the mud and stumbled upright, breath ragged and clothes soaked. He risked a look back. Thibodeaux lurked just beneath the surface, only the eyes visible now, watching him with predatory patience. It didn't have to rush. The swamp wasn't on Willis's side and never had been. Remy's voice drifted through the trees. Not loud but clear. "Ain't no use runnin', Chair. You in his house." Willis wiped mud from his eyes, anger sharpening his focus into something dangerous. "Then it's time to evict the tenant." The words left his mouth without hesitation, but beneath them was a growing realization. He wasn't going to win this by force or fire. He needed strategy. He needed to understand what held Remy here, why the old man believed so deeply in the beast that guarded him. The swamp settled again, waiting for the next move. And Willis Grant, for the first time in his career, understood he'd entered a world where the law meant nothing, and the land itself decided who survived. Willis stood dripping and furious on the far bank, mud clinging to him like a second skin, breath pulling in sharp through his teeth as he tried to shake the weight of what had just happened. Behind him, the swamp settled into a heavy, uneasy quiet, as if the entire place exhaled at once after watching a show meant for its eyes alone. Thibodeaux's gaze still lingered from the waterline, those amber orbs steady, patient, and terrifying in their lack of urgency. The gator didn't retreat. He didn't chase. He simply waited, letting Willis understand the deeper, more unsettling truth. This wasn't a battle. Not to the beast. This was a ritual, one the swamp had watched 1,000 times before. And the swamp, for reasons Willis didn't yet grasp, wasn't taking sides. It was letting the men decide their own damnation. Willis wiped a streak of muck from his brow and forced himself upright, spine straightening as though pulled by a string tied to pride itself. He refused to let the swamp see weakness. He'd been embarrassed, yes, maybe even shaken. But fear was a line he didn't cross lightly. He leveled his eyes on Remy Boudreaux, who still stood on that rotted platform with the same calm expression he'd worn from the beginning. There was no mockery in the old man's face, no triumph, no malice, just a deep, unwavering resignation, as if Remy had known exactly how this night would unfold and had simply been waiting for Willis to catch up. The old Cajun cupped his hands around his mouth and called out across the clearing, his voice carrying with surprising strength for a man so lean. "Share, you still breathin', so the swamp ain't judged you yet. Best take that as a kindness." His tone wasn't taunting, it was instructional, like a patient father speaking to a stubborn child who had grabbed the wrong end of a snake. Willis holstered his Colt, though the gesture was more for clarity than surrender. "I didn't come here to make peace with your animals, Boudreaux," he called back, voice steady even as the swamp air chewed at the sound. "I came to shut you down, and I will." Remy tilted his head slightly, the gesture soft, almost pitying. He stepped closer to the edge of his platform, the boards creaking under his bare feet. "You don't hear good, do you, Chair? I told you. This ain't your fight. Ain't never been." The old man crouched, dipping one hand into the water beside the platform. He murmured something under his breath, soft, rhythmic, foreign, and the water around his hand trembled with a pulse that didn't match any breeze Willis could feel. Thibodeaux responded instantly, lowering his massive head in a slow, obedient motion, like a hound hearing its master's whistle. A cold realization pricked the back of Willis's mind, not fear, not superstition, but logic. If this gator truly responded to Remy's voice, if this old Cajun had somehow managed to train a creature like that, then shutting down the Still wasn't just a matter of confiscating equipment. It meant dismantling the entire network of survival the old man had created. It meant stripping him of the one thing standing between him and the swamp's hunger. It meant forcing Remy into a world he clearly had no intention of rejoining. Willis stepped forward, boots sinking again but not as deeply. He approached the central clearing cautiously, keeping a wide berth between himself and the water. "Training an animal doesn't make you invincible, Boudreaux," he said. "You think that gator makes you untouchable? You're a man running from the law. The law always catches up." Remy stood slowly, shaking water from his fingers with deliberate calm. "You don't get it, federal man. I ain't running from nothing. Not the law. Not the swamp. Not even death. I stay because this bayou got rules older than anything you carry in that badge, and I honor 'em." The old man walked the edge of the platform with easy balance, each footfall precise, every movement practiced from decades of navigating boards slick with algae. Moonlight washed over his face, revealing more lines than Willis had noticed before, not age lines, but story lines, carved by weather and loss and choices made long ago. "You think I'm here 'cause I'm afraid of your prison? You wrong. Prison's clean, predictable, full of men who make noise and pretend it means something. This swamp don't pretend. It takes who it wants, spares who it wants, and don't never apologize." He pointed one long finger at Willis, "And tonight, it let you live. Ask yourself why." Willis fought the urge to glance back toward the water. He wouldn't give the old man that satisfaction. "It let me live," he said, tightening his stance, "because I don't go down easy, and because your beast missed." Remy barked out a laugh, not mocking, but weary, knowing, the kind that comes from having watched too many men say the same thing before the swamp took their bones. "Thibodeaux don't miss, Chair. He measures." The words lingered in the thick air, hanging heavier than the humidity. Willis felt something cold slip down his spine, not fear of the creature, but awareness of what Remy meant. Thibodeaux had tasted his presence, calculated him, chose not to finish what he began. And that meant Willis wasn't just dealing with instinct, he was dealing with a creature that had, at the very least, a form of judgment. Willis shook the thought loose. "Enough riddles, Boudreaux. You're harboring a Still in violation of federal law. You're producing illegal liquor. That alone gets you 5 years. Assault on an officer? That adds more. Harboring a dangerous animal? That stop talking like your words mean something out here," Remy interrupted, not sharply but with a soft firmness that somehow struck deeper than a shout would have. He sat on the edge of his platform, legs dangling above the black water, hands resting loosely on his knees. You comin' here thinking law matters, thinking justice is something written on paper. But this swamp got its own justice, and it don't need no courthouse. The old man exhaled, long and slow. For the first time there was no defiance in him, only truth. Before Prohibition came, before the revenuers, before railroads even, this place belonged to the water and the spirits hidin' in it. My papa told me stories about men getting swallowed for lyin', for stealin', for disrespectin' what they couldn't understand. He say the swamp don't punish wrong, it punishes ego. Willis crossed his arms, jaw tightening. And what's your excuse, Boudreaux? Ego? You think you're some kind of swamp prophet, making poison and sending it up the river? Remy stared at the fire beneath the still, the low glow dancing across the copper. I ain't making poison. I'm making medicine. Relief. A man drinks my shine. He forgets his troubles for one night. You put folks in jail. All they do is remember. Willis stepped closer, closing the gap until only a row of roots separated them. This isn't philosophy. It's crime. Remy met his gaze without blinking. Crime is what rich men call survival when poor men do it. For a long moment, the air between them felt as thick as the mud. Willis wanted to argue, to spit back a rebuttal crafted from a lifetime of law and order. But something in Remy's eyes stopped him. Not wisdom exactly, but conviction. The kind of conviction that grows only from a lifetime of loss and the stubbornness to keep living anyway. A distant splash echoed from deeper in the swamp. Not Thibodeaux, something lighter, faster. Remy's expression shifted slightly, something cautious threading into his calm. You ain't the only one comin' tonight, Cher, he murmured. Swamp been restless since sundown. You feel it? Willis listened. The silence was different now, not empty, but crowded. The kind of silence that suggested eyes watching from the dark, breath held in anticipation. Something was changing, moving. The swamp had shifted its mood. Remy stood again, more quickly this time. You brought others with you? Agents? Hunters? The question carried no fear, only frustration. Willis shook his head. Came alone. Remy cursed under his breath in Cajun French, glancing toward the south channel. That ain't good. That ain't good at all. Willis stepped forward. What's coming? Remy pointed at the dark water with a hand that suddenly trembled. Men who ain't from here. Men who don't respect Thibodeaux. And men like that. His voice trailed off as the water at the far edge of the clearing rippled. They don't last long. The first hint of danger arrived in the form of lantern light bouncing, erratic, cutting through the trees in disjointed flickers. Voices followed. Male voices. Loud, careless, drunk on bravado and ignorance. Remy closed his eyes in a slow, pained sigh. Lord help 'em. They don't know what they waken. Willis looked toward the lights, instincts sharpening. Who are they? Remy's answer was as heavy as the humid night around them. People far worse than revenuers. The swamp exhaled again, low and warning. And the night that began with a shot was far from finished. The lantern lights wove through the trees in a stumbling pattern, swaying like fireflies trapped in whiskey jars. Willis recognized the sound of men who believed darkness had no authority over them, the kind of men who stepped loudly because silence made them nervous. Their voices drifted across the water in rowdy bursts, the kind of laughter that didn't belong anywhere near Bayou Salem. It grated against the swamp's natural rhythm, an intrusion so offensive that the frogs remained quiet, holding themselves in the suspended stillness of creatures waiting for danger to walk past. Remy's jaw tightened, the first sign of true irritation cracking his calm. Damn fools, he muttered, almost too softly to hear. I prayed they stayed north of the parish line, but greed got a way of sniffing out opportunity. He walked the length of his platform, leaning out to catch a better angle on the approaching torch glow. His silhouette stiffened as the first figures came into view through the thin veil of moss. 3 men, possibly 4, all white, all armed, and all wearing the kind of clothing that said they'd never spent more than a few hours in swamp water at a time. Their boots were too clean, their jackets too stiff, and their lanterns too bright. Nobody who knew the bayou carried exposed light. It made you a target for creatures that navigated by vibration and hunger more than sight. These men didn't know that. They barreled forward, swinging machetes at vines, stomping through roots, letting the steel tips of their rifles clack against branches. Willis stepped away from the roots and toward the clearing, his instincts shifting from hunter to tactician. "Who are they?" he asked again, voice low, careful. Remy didn't look back when he answered. "They call themselves the Cormier boys. Ain't from here, but they been making trouble east of Lafitte. Heard stories of a Cajun with a shine, still no revenuer can touch. They want what I built, want the recipe, the copper, the roots, want the business, but they ain't got the respect to earn it. Thugs who mistook intimidation for strategy. The kind who believed that if a man lived deep in the swamp, he was isolated enough to be easy prey." He kept his eyes fixed on the approaching figures, calculating positioning, cover, and the nearest route toward higher ground. The lantern light brightened as the first of the Cormier boys stepped into the clearing, a tall man with greasy blonde hair, jaw sharp as a hatchet, and the swagger of someone certain he belonged at the center of whatever trouble he stirred. He carried a pump shotgun across his shoulders like a trophy. Behind him came a squat, barrel-chested man swinging a machete at hanging vines with unnecessary force. A third followed with a rifle, scanning the shadows with the nervous energy of someone who had heard rumors he didn't want to believe. The blond man grinned as he spotted Willis. "Looks like we got company, boys," he said, voice thick with a South Louisiana accent but lacking the softness of Cajun French. "Didn't expect to find no revenuer this deep. What'd you do, get lost?" Willis didn't reply. The men were drunk on confidence, which made them unpredictable. He held a stance that communicated readiness but not aggression, hoping to keep the situation contained long enough to understand their motives. Remy finally stepped forward on the platform, hands empty but posture unyielding. "Go home," he said, no more forceful than if he'd been offering weather advice. "This swamp ain't for you." The blond man turned toward Remy with a smirk that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Ain't for you neither, old man. Shine business don't got room for relics. Heard you got yourself a pet down here. Some kind of big lizard that scares revenuers off. That's a good trick. We want that trick." The third man, the jumpy one with the rifle, swallowed visibly and glanced toward the water. "I heard it ain't no trick," he whispered. "He got a real monster down there." The leader scoffed. "Ain't no such thing as monsters. Just big gators and small men." Willis watched Remy closely. The old Cajun didn't flinch, didn't bristle, didn't even look offended. Instead, he scanned the edges of the clearing, as though checking at something unseen. Willis followed his gaze and felt the shift too. The swamp was stirring again. The air grew denser, thick with the electric tension that precedes a storm or a battle. The water near the platform rippled small movements at first, then deeper ones. Something was repositioning itself beneath the surface. Remy spoke again, this time with the gravity of a man issuing a final warning. "I ain't tellin' y'all twice. Turn around. Leave the bayou. Ain't nothing here for you but water graves." The blonde Cormier laughed hard enough to bend at the waist. "Old man, I coulda dragged you out by your beard 10 years ago. Ain't scared of no swamp, no gator, and damn sure no Cajun witchcraft." Remy's expression hardened at the word witchcraft, though not in anger and sadness. "You think this is superstition," he said softly. "You think we out here playing with charms and stories. But respect ain't superstition. It's the difference between livin' and feedin' the mud." Willis took a step forward, injecting authority into the space. "This is a federal situation now. All of you need to lower your weapons and step away from Boudreaux." The blond man looked Willis up and down. "Federal? Out here?" He spat into the mud. He raised his shotgun slightly, not aiming but implying. "Tell you what, lawman, we only need one of y'all alive to show us the still, so unless you want to drown in this soup, you'll walk away nice and quiet." Willis felt the temperature in the clearing rise by several degrees. The machete man muttered something about killin' the revenuer first. The jumpy one cursed under his breath, and then, as if the swamp itself had grown tired of the noise, everything stopped. The water at the edge of the clearing bulged outward in a slow, ominous swell. The reeds bent. The mud trembled. A force moved beneath them, deliberate and enormous. The blond man noticed it too late. Thibodeaux broke the surface with the silent violence of a nightmare given muscle and direction. His jaws emerged first wide, jagged, ancient. Water streamed down the ridges of his skull as he rose, revealing the sheer magnitude of his body, a living log of armored flesh. The gator lunged with terrifying speed, not at Remy, not at Willis, but at the man holding the machete. The swamp erupted. The machete man barely had time to shout before Thibodeaux's jaws clamped around his midsection. The scream that split the clearing was cut short as the gator dragged him sideways, smashing him against a cypress root before pulling him under with a sickening splash. The water churned violently, reeds shaking with the struggle beneath. The blond man shouted in horror and fired his shotgun, the blast echoing across the bayou. Pellets peppered Thibodeaux's back, but the gator didn't slow. The jumpy rifleman ran backward, tripping over a root and falling hard into the bent mud. Remy's voice cut through the chaos, fierce and commanding in a way Willis had never heard. "Back away from the water, all of you! Get high ground, now!" But panic erased reason. The blond man fired again, hitting nothing but water. The rifleman scrambled on hands and knees, whimpering prayers in a voice too soft to reach any god. Willis moved toward the nearest rise, grabbing a low branch to haul himself up. He wasn't running, he was surviving. The water exploded again as Thibodeaux surfaced with a violent thrash, tossing the limp body of the machete man aside like discarded bait. The blond man screamed and stumbled backward. His boots hit slick mud, sliding out from under him. He fell hard, shotgun clattering away. Willis shouted, "Get up! Move!" But the swamp was already choosing its next victim. The blond Cormier boy struggled in the mud like a trapped hog, scrambling with hands that slid uselessly through slime as he tried to push himself upright. His breath came out in tight, panicked grunts, not the confident, swaggering drawl he'd brought with him. Every sound he made, every splash, every scrape, every frantic curse ran across the swamp like a dinner bell. The water answered him with another deep ripple, wide enough to push reeds outward in a ring. Thibodeaux was circling. He didn't move like a beast chasing prey. He moved like a force of nature, something tidal, ancient, inevitable. The swamp itself seemed to bend around his path as though making room for a king returning to his throne. Willis had pulled himself onto the rise of cypress roots, boots braced and shoulders tense, watching with the focus of a man trapped between instinct and duty. His mind churned, trying to separate what was survivable from what was not, and what he was obligated to intervene in versus what no man on earth could interrupt without signing his own death warrant. He held his hand near his Colt not because he believed the bullets would do much, but because his training demanded that he face danger with something more than bare hands and a prayer. The swamp hissed around him, not from steam or mist, but from the collective breath of a world that had paused to watch judgment unfold. Remy, still on the platform, had gone pale beneath his weathered skin. He shouted to the blond Cormier with more urgency than Willis had heard him use at any point before. "Get to a tree, climb something, get off the mud!" It wasn't sympathy, it was practical survival. Even Remy, for all his fatalism, didn't want anyone feeding the swamp unnecessarily. But panic makes a man deaf, and fear makes him foolish. The blond boy only flailed harder, hands clawing at roots without gripping them, shotgun abandoned several feet away, mud rising around him like hands trying to pull him down. Thibodeaux's tail sliced the surface of the water as he pivoted. The movement sent a spray of droplets glittering across the clearing, each one catching the lantern light for a heartbeat before falling back into darkness. Willis recognized the signs. The predator wasn't attacking in blind fury. He was positioning, calculating. It was the same kind of deliberation he'd seen in trained hunting dogs or men preparing an ambush. Except this beast weighed more than any hunting dog and more than some wagons Willis had seen, and the swamp empowered him with terrain no human could outthink. The remaining Cormier rifleman had managed to stagger upright. He backed away from the water, shaking so violently the lantern he held cast wild, drunken shapes across the trees. "We gotta go!" he shrieked, voice cracking like a boy's. "We gotta go now. I told y'all this place ain't right, I told you." His panic shifted into pure terror when the reeds beside him quaked. He fired blindly, the crack of the rifle echoing in a scattershot echo that dissolved uselessly into the swamp air. The bullet didn't hit Thibodeaux, but it did hit the water, and that alone was enough to provoke a response. Willis couldn't even tell if it was the same gator or another one called to the violence like vultures to a carcass. The rifleman screamed, stumbling backward into a pool that swallowed him thigh-deep in one step. The lantern dropped from his hand, hissing out in the water with a puff of smoke. He kicked wildly, splashing so loudly it hurt the ears. Something seized his boot. His scream went ragged, then shrill, then cut short as he vanished beneath the surface. The water closed over him quickly, too quickly, like it had been waiting with a mouth wide open. The blonde Cormier saw his companion disappear and snapped back into survival in a way only shock can bring. He lunged for the shotgun, dragging himself across the mud with furious determination. He reached it, grabbed it with shaking hands, and pumped around into the chamber with a grinding, desperate sound. But mud clogged the mechanism, and the gun jammed. His curse turned into a bark of despair as he slammed the weapon against the ground, trying to clear it. He didn't look up quickly enough to see the dark water rising behind him in a swelling mound that grew and grew until Willis could see the full length of Thibodeaux's ridged back breaking the surface. This was not a routine hunt. This was judgment. Willis forced himself off the roots, moving closer despite every instinct demanding he stay put. As an agent of the law, he could not simply stand by while bodies filled the swamp. But as a thinking man, he knew that stepping into the mud meant death. He needed an angle, something beyond bullets. He grabbed a length of fallen branch, thick as a club but long enough to keep distance between him and snapping jaws. Remy saw the movement and shook his head fiercely. "Don't be a fool, Chair. You ain't stoppin' what's comin'." His voice cracked with a warning born not of fear for Willis, but fear of what the swamp might do if another man interfered with its claim. But Willis wasn't listening. Duty was a stubborn ache in his chest. He moved down the slope toward firmer ground, boots sliding but controlled. If he could get to the blond man, drag him up even a few feet, maybe Thibodeaux made the next move. He lunged so fast that Willis saw nothing but a blur of scales and teeth. The gator's jaws crashed around the shotgun instead of the man's arm, wrenching the weapon from his grip and flinging it aside like a twig. The blond boy screamed, not from contact but from realization. His elbows dug into the mud as he tried to retreat backward, feet slipping uselessly. Thibodeaux swung his massive head, knocking the man sideways with a blow that sent a spray of muck across the clearing. The man rolled onto his stomach, coughing violently as mud clogged his mouth. Willis reached him then. He grabbed the back of the man's jacket and hauled him upward, with a strength born of adrenaline, dragging him out of the immediate reach of the gator. The blonde Cormier clung to Willis's arm like a drowning child, too shocked to speak. Willis tightened his grip, pulling him toward a tangle of cypress roots that offered a few feet of elevation. It wasn't safe, but it was safer. Behind them, Thibodeaux turned, his eyes locked onto the movement with a cold reptilian certainty that made Willis's stomach drop. The gator didn't chase, he advanced slowly, methodically, as if savoring the inevitability of his approach. The water parted around him in ripples that spread across the clearing in a widening circle. Even Remy stepped back from the platform edge, eyes wide in something closer to grief than fear. "Share." Remy whispered shakily toward Willis. "Let him go. This ain't your burden." The swamp claimed him the moment he stepped in. Willis kept pulling. "Not on my watch." His boots dug into roots, slick with moss, muscles, burning as he lifted the terrified man inch by inch. The blonde Cormier sobbed and clutched the bark, dragging himself higher. For a moment, Willis thought they might make it. For one breathless, hanging second, he thought they might outrun judgment. Then the gator surged upward. The water detonated around Thibodeaux in a violent explosion of force. His jaws snapped shut with a sound like two oak logs slamming together. The blond boy screamed so piercingly it rattled the air, but the scream came from pain, not death. Willis felt a violent jerk in his grip. Thibodeaux hadn't taken the man's leg. He'd taken his foot. The boot came off in a spray of mud and fabric, snapping free from the man's ankle. The gator fell backward into the water with the boot between his teeth. The blond man fainted instantly. His body went limp in Willis's grasp. Willis dragged him fully onto the roots, chest heaving, arms trembling with effort. Mud streaked his face, his clothes, his hands. He couldn't tell if the blond man was breathing, not over the pounding of his own pulse in his ears. He felt for movement there, the faint rise of breath. He'd saved him, but saving a man from the swamp wasn't the same as saving him from the consequences of trespassing. Thibodeaux surfaced again, boot still clamped in his jaw. He stared at Willis with an expression that no animal should carry something that looked too much like warning, or recognition, or disdain. He shook the boot once, the way a dog shakes a toy. Remy stepped forward again, voice low, words thick with sorrow. "You did something the swamp won't forget, Chair. You took a man from its mouth. Now you owe it." Willis turned toward him, breath harsh. "I don't owe anything." Remy's eyes flicked toward the dark water. The swamp's surface rippled. All around them, in every direction. Many ripples. Not one, not two. The whole bayou. Something was coming. And Willis realized then, saving one man had balanced nothing. The swamp wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The ripples spread outward in slow, concentric rings, each one widening the silence that had settled over the clearing. Willis had felt tension before during raids, in standoffs, in the long, quiet moments before a desperate man decided whether he meant to shoot or surrender. But nothing compared to the oppressive stillness closing in around Bayou Salem now. It wasn't the silence of breath held in fear. It was the silence of something ancient waking up. The swamp vibrated beneath the roots, a low hum rising through the waterlogged earth, as if a great engine were turning somewhere deep below, stirring mud and memory alike. Even the lingering lantern light from Willis's pack dimmed as the mist thickened, curling around tree trunks like spectral fingers drawing curtains shut. Remy sensed it first. His posture shifted from the taut readiness of a man defending his home to the bowed shoulders of someone facing a force that dwarfed whatever claim he believed he had upon the bayou. He stepped to the edge of his platform, eyes scanning the dark water with a wary reverence usually reserved for church pews and deathbeds. His voice, when it finally slipped past his lips, came out in a strained whisper, though the words themselves carried the weight of thunder. "This ain't Thibodeaux alone, Chair. You woke the whole damn swamp." Willis steadied the blond man in the crook of the cypress roots, feeling the unconscious weight sag against him like a sack of wet grain. The man's breathing was shallow but steady, each breath a ragged pull that signaled shock but not death. Willis wiped muck from the man's forehead, not out of compassion but out of instinctual triage ingrained by years of field duty. He checked for bleeding, for broken bones, for signs the gator's teeth had done more than take the boot. But aside from the injured ankle, swollen, raw, and pulsing with pain, the blond boy had been lucky. Lucky for now. Willis looked up, jaw clenched tightly. "What's happening, Boudreaux? What did we wake?" Remy didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the widening ripples, counting them, reading them, interpreting their patterns like a man deciphering scripture. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "The swamp don't like when balance gets broken. Cormier boys came to take what wasn't theirs. You came to enforce law that don't belong to this place. And now you done something even worse. You pulled a man out the swamp's claim." He pointed at the unconscious blond boy. "That one was meant to feed the mud. Snatched him back. Swamp don't take kindly to interrupted cycles." Willis stared at him, exhausted and angry. "So you're telling me this place wants blood? That it keeps score like some kind of goddamn judge?" Remy's expression tightened. "I ain't saying it want blood. I'm saying it understands debt. You take. From it, you give back. That's how this land work. My papa taught me that. his papa taught him. Ain't about superstition, it's about respect. You interfere with the swamp's judgment, the swamp come collect something equal. Willis shook his head, refusing to accept the logic. Nature doesn't bargain, old man. Animals don't negotiate. These are beasts reacting to noise, chaos, blood in the water. Remy gave a humorless smile, one built from decades of watching men like Willis misunderstand things that didn't care to be understood. You keep telling yourself that if it help you breathe, but you hear that? He tilted his head. Willis listened. At first, he thought it was wind pushing through the trees, except the air was still as stone. Then, he thought it was distant thunder, except there wasn't a cloud dense enough to charge lightning. Then he realized what it was, the low, rhythmic churn of bodies moving through water. Not one body, many, dozens. The sound rose and fell with methodical precision, like an army marching through a flooded corridor. And with each churn, the ground beneath Willis's boots vibrated. He swallowed the rising knot in his throat. "More gators?" he asked, though he knew the answer before Remy said it. "Whole family," Remy whispered. "Thibodeaux ain't the only king out here. You think he the only one old as sin? The swamp got lines. Dynasties. You trespass on one, you trespass on all." The moonlight thinned as clouds drifted across the sky, layering the clearing in a dim bluish shadow. The temperature dipped, a strange shift considering the thickness of the humidity. The mud underfoot softened further, as though water levels had begun to rise in anticipation of something. From the far side of the clearing, a cluster of reeds bent outward, pushed by something approaching from beneath. Then another cluster. And another. Willis stepped back up onto the cypress roots, lifting the blond man a little higher with a grunt of effort. The man groaned faintly, instinctively tightening his grip on the bark even in unconscious fear. Willis set his stance and drew his Colt. The metal felt small in his hand, pathetic even. 12 years in enforcement and he'd believed himself armed. Out here, he might as well have been holding a pocket knife against a coming tide. "Boudreaux," Willis said thickly, "if this is your fault, if you attracted these animals by feeding them, by keeping that monster as a pet." Remy cut him off with a sharp flick of his hand. "Thibodeaux ain't no pet. I raised him, sure, but I ain't control him. I protect this land the way he protect me. Swamp don't serve no man share. Don't fool yourself." The water near the center of the clearing broke open again. Not violently this time, but with a slow, rising swell. A massive shape moved beneath the surface, spreading outward like a dark shadow. A head rose first, smaller than Thibodeaux's, but still formidable. Then another. Then a third. Willis counted 5 in the immediate vicinity. More coming behind them, he suspected, drawn by the scent of blood and fear. The swamp gators had united, a congregation of ancient reptiles converging with collective intent. Each gator surfaced with eerie quiet. Their eyes glowed faintly with that same swamp fire reflection, yellow-green like embers smoldering beneath coals. They formed a semicircle around the platform and the roots, leaving deliberate gaps between them as though creating a boundary. Willis realized something then. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They were surrounding, judging, deciding. The idea that these creatures moved with such coordination seemed absurd, but the evidence floated in front of him in cold, patient stillness. These were not instinct-driven strikes. These were movements guided by something he didn't have a name for, some unspoken code threading through the swamp's dark history. Willis's voice dropped to a low growl. "Is this it then? They're waiting for me to hand over the boy?" "Maybe," Remy said quietly. "Maybe they waiting for something else. Maybe they want you. You the one who interfered. You the one who stood against the swamp's pick." Willis stiffened. "I was doing my job." Remy rasped out a bitter laugh. "Then pray your job worth dying for." The surface of the water trembled in a measured rhythm, and from the largest ripple rose Thibodeaux's head, eyes gleaming with an intelligence Willis no longer doubted. He drifted closer to the roots, his jaw opening and closing slowly in the water, releasing a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through Willis's boots like a warning. Remy pointed toward the center of the clearing. They want choice, chair. You took something from the swamp's mouth. Swamp wants something in return. Willis tightened his grip on the limp blonde man, jaw clenching enough to hurt. You want me to throw him back? Remy flinched at the phrasing but didn't deny it. It ain't about killing or saving. It about balance. He trespassed. He drew blood. He mocked what you don't mock. Swamp marked him. You taking him back makes you part of that chain. Willis stared at the unconscious man he didn't like, didn't respect, didn't owe anything to, but couldn't give up. He wasn't built that way. The law wasn't built that way. You don't hand a man over to die, even if the swamp demands it. Willis's voice came out low, strained. I can't do that. Remy closed his eyes. Then the swamp take what else it find worthy. Willis's pulse hammered. Meaning what? Remy opened his eyes again, filled with a terrible knowing. You. Before Willis could answer, the swamp exhaled. All at once, every gator sank, slowly, silently, disappearing beneath the surface like stones dropped into still water. The clearing went dead still. Willis felt the water deepen around, the roots, felt the mud soften, felt the ancient hunger rising again, different now, focused. The swamp had made its choice, and Willis Grant was the debt it meant to claim. The moment the gators sank, the swamp felt emptier and more crowded at the same time, the way a courtroom feels just before the judge walks in. Willis stood locked in place on the cypress roots, every instinct in his body screaming that stillness might save him, while every scrap of training he'd ever had insisted that inaction was its own kind of suicide. The unconscious blond man slumped beside him, head lolling against the bark, breath shallow but steadier now, as if he had been pulled out of one nightmare and laid gently at the edge of another. The air pressed down with a heaviness that had nothing to do with humidity. It was the weight of attention, as though the swamp itself had turned its gaze on Willis and was deciding how exactly to collect what it was owed. Remy watched from the platform, hands hanging limp at his sides, shoulders bowed beneath a burden Willis couldn't yet see but could feel. The old Cajun's face looked older than ever, carved with lines of regret and knowledge, like a man who had read the end of the book before anyone else and had spent years trying in vain to rewrite it. He spoke quietly, but his words carried across the water as if the bayou itself wanted Willis to hear every syllable. You feel that, chair? That tightness in your chest? That way the ground feel like it ain't holding you so sure no more? That's the swamp settling its account. You put your hand in and stirred up the pot. Now it wants a taste of you. Willis's jaw clenched as he swept his eyes across the black sheet of water. Nothing broke the surface, yet the sense of movement thrummed from below like drums in a buried parade. He didn't believe in curses, in spirits, in swamps that kept ledgers the way bookkeepers did. Yet he couldn't argue with what he had seen: gators moving in formation, choosing targets, sparing him when they could have dragged him under easily, then circling as though waiting for a decision. He tightened his grip on the blond man's coat, feeling the trembling muscles beneath the fabric. I'm not giving him up, Willis said, voice low but unshakable. I'm not handing a man over to be torn apart because some old stories say the swamp deserves it. That ain't justice. Remy shook his head slowly, his hair swaying like damp rope. You still think justice is something men own. Out here, law ain't what you write down. It's what you survive. You saved that boy, and maybe that's noble in your world, but in this one, it means something else. You broke a rule older than either of us. Swamp picked him. You pulled him back. Now the debt gotta come from somewhere. He paused, eyes going distant for a heartbeat, as if listening to something only he could hear. And it picked you. The mud beneath, the roots shifted with a subtle lurch that made Willis's stomach drop. It wasn't a slide like erosion or a slow sink like normal swamp rot. It was a deliberate settling, a gentle tug downward that felt almost like a hand closing around his boots. The roots he stood on creaked, their embedded tips loosening in mud that had been firm minutes before. The waterline inched higher, seeping over the lowest knots of wood like creeping fingers. Somewhere behind him a bubble rose and popped, releasing a smell of sulfur and decay that rode the air like a warning. Willis glanced down, then back at Remy, anger flaring to cut through the fear. "You talk like this place is some kind of judge and jury," he snapped. "You say it don't serve no man, but it listens to you. You raised that thing. You kept this still here. You fed the stories that made this swamp untouchable. Maybe this debt you keep talking about ain't mine at all. Maybe it's yours." Remy flinched, not at the accusation itself, but at the clarity in it. For the first time, guilt flickered openly across his features. "You think I don't know that?" he said, voice rough. "You think I ain't spent half my life wondering if every body this swamp took was on my soul ledger? I brought Thibodeaux close. I used fear to keep men away. I chose to live in a place that don't forgive easy. That's my burden. But tonight, Chair." He looked at the blond man, then at Willis. "You put yourself between the swamp and what it claimed. That ain't on me. That's on you and that badge." The water swelled again, closer this time, and a dark shape brushed against the submerged portion of the roots. The entire tangle shuddered, tipping slightly. The blond man slid half an inch downward, a moan escaping his throat as his injured leg bumped against wood. Willis caught him, bracing with his own weight, but felt his boots lose purchase as the mud beneath the roots liquefied. He realized then that the swamp didn't need to drag him under with gator teeth. It could simply dissolve the ground beneath him, let gravity and water do the work. The thought sent a cold spike down his spine. He scanned the clearing, eyes landing on the one solid structure above the waterline, the platform holding Remy's still. Its stilts were old, yes, but they were anchored into deeper, more compact earth beneath the muck. If he could get off the roots and onto that platform, he'd at least have the advantage of height. But the path between them was nothing but slick mud and black water, a perfect stage for something waiting just below the surface. He measured the distance, the angle, the timing. It looked impossible, but so had a lot of things he'd done before they were finished. "Can that platform hold 3 men?" Willis called, nodding toward it. Remy hesitated just long enough for the answer to sting. "If you move quick, and if the swamp lets you." "Then it's gonna let me," Willis replied, more to himself than to Remy, "because I ain't dying in the mud for trying to save a life." He shifted his weight, dragging the blond man upright and slinging one limp arm over his own shoulders. The injured man groaned as his ruined ankle brushed the roots, but unconsciousness kept him from fully waking to the pain. Willis tightened his grip and lowered himself off the higher knots of wood, boots plunging into mud that rose nearly to his calves. The cold shocked him, drawing a sharp hiss between his teeth. He leaned forward, using the cypress roots as a balancing rail as he waded toward the platform. The swamp reacted instantly. Water swirled around his legs with sudden, unnatural force, tugging at his ankles, trying to twist his feet sideways. A tail not strong enough to break bone, but plenty strong enough to cause a fall brushed the back of his calf. Willis staggered, nearly dropping the blond man. He forced his body forward, each step a battle, against suction and unseen hands pulling backward. The mud tried to claim his boots. Somewhere to his right, a shape glided past, close enough for him to feel the wake ripple against his thigh. Remy shouted from the platform, his voice cutting through the mounting panic. "Left side, Chair. There's a ridge, little higher ground. Follow the cypress with the split trunk." Willis squinted through the dimness, spotting the tree Remy meant a cypress whose trunk forked near the base like a pair of legs. He adjusted his path, every muscle in his body protesting as he dragged the extra weight. The mud shallowed fractionally underfoot as he neared the indicated ridge, giving him a few precious inches of height. Then the swamp made its next move. A gator's head surfaced 3 yards ahead, water streaming from its eyes and snout as it lifted just enough to block the path. Its jaws opened slightly, not in a lunge but in a display, rows of teeth glinting faintly. Another head rose behind him, closer than he liked. A third surfaced off to his left. They were hemming him in again, not attacking, waiting for him to make their work easier. Willis's heart pounded hard enough to make his vision pulse. He turned his head just enough to see Remy. The old man's face had gone grim and resolved in a way Willis recognized from battlefields and back-alley raids. It was the look of a man who had just made a decision he'd been avoiding for years. Remy moved quickly now, more quickly than his age should have allowed. He grabbed a half-empty kerosene can from beside the still and kicked over the smoldering fire beneath the boiler, sending a scattering of hot coals onto the platform. The faint flames licked upward as he doused them with the fuel, turning them into a sudden sheet of angry orange. "What are you doing?" Willis shouted, disbelief cracking his composure. Remy didn't answer with words at first. He grabbed a long wooden pole used for stirring mash and thrust it into the flames, holding it there until the tip caught fire and burned hot. Then he turned toward the water and raised his voice in a wild, guttural cry that sounded part prayer, part curse. "You want debt, you old beast?" he yelled into the dark. "You hungry for flesh? Then take what you've been circling my whole damn life." He leapt off the platform. Willis watched in stunned horror as the old Cajun hit the swamp water with a splash that seemed too small for the enormity of the moment. The torch flared as it met the damp air, hissing and spitting droplets of flame. Remy waded toward the nearest gator head, the one blocking Willis's path, swinging the burning tip in wide arcs that cast wild shadows across the water. "You know me, Thibodeaux," he shouted, voice cracking. "I raised you, I fed you, I brought you close to men you could have eaten every day, and I told you no. You want balance? You want payment? Then you look at me, old friend. You take what's yours." The gators reacted to the fire with a mixture of caution and agitation. The nearest one sank, then resurfaced a yard to the side, eyes narrowed. Another behind Willis shifted backward, creating a gap in the half-circle. The water churned more violently now, as though stirred from below by a dozen thrashing tails. Thibodeaux's massive head rose from the center, towering over Remy. For a heartbeat that stretched like taffy, they simply stared at each other, old man and old beast, both tethered to the same haunted patch of earth by years of shared survival. Remy lowered the torch a few inches, so its reflection flickered in the gator's eyes. "You know this ain't his sin," he said softly, nodding toward Willis. "He just doing what he think right. I'm the one fed you. I'm the one kept this still burning. I'm the one who turned fear into my shield. If there's a debt, it's got my name on it. Always did." Thibodeaux's jaw flexed slowly, water dripping from each scale. The beast remained still in that uncanny way only reptiles can. A statue carved from muscle and ancient hunger. Then, with a suddenness that ripped a choked sound from Willis's throat, the gator surged forward. He didn't lunge toward Willis. He lunged toward Remy. The old Cajun didn't run. He didn't raise the torch to fend the beast off. He lifted it higher instead, as if offering the last of its light to the sky. Thibodeaux hit him with the full force of centuries of survival, jaws snapping around his waist in a grim, final embrace. The torch flew from Remy's hand, landing in the water where it sputtered and hissed before dying out. The last thing Willis saw of Remy Boudreaux was his face, eyes closed, mouth moving in what might have been a prayer or a curse or a farewell, as the swamp swallowed him whole in a froth of black water and bubbles. The clearing fell utterly silent. The gators sank, all of them. The pressure in the air lifted just enough for Willis to breathe without feeling strangled. The mud beneath his boots stopped tugging, settling into a firmer hold that felt once again like simple earth instead of a living thing. The water around his legs stilled. Even the rising tide that had been creeping toward the roots seemed to halt, as though the swamp had made its decision, taken its due, and closed the ledger for the night. Willis stared at the spot where Remy had disappeared, chest heaving, mind racing to make sense of something no training manual had ever prepared him for. He didn't know how long he stood there, seconds, minutes, maybe longer, before the practical part of his brain snapped back into command. The blond man at his side stirred, moaning louder as a fresh wave of pain reached him. Willis tightened his grip and pushed forward, the path to the platform now remarkably clear. He reached the stilts and found a lower brace to haul himself up, every muscle protesting. Somehow he managed to drag both himself and the half-conscious Cormier boy onto the boards, collapsing there with a groan that echoed Remy's earlier exhaustion. The still crackled faintly as residual heat from the scattered coals met damp wood. The kerosene smell lingered, mingled now with something else: melancholy, finality, the aftertaste of sacrifice. Willis lay there a moment, listening. Nothing rose from the water. No eyes broke the surface. No tails rippled beneath. The swamp had gone back to being what it had always been: a dark, dangerous stretch of water and mud, indifferent to one more man breathing or not breathing above it. By the time dawn bruised the sky with pale gray, Willis had managed to get the blond man into the small skiff tied near the edge of the clearing. The Cormier boy was feverish, leg bandaged with strips torn from Willis's shirt, face pale under the streaks of mud. Willis pushed off from the platform with a wooden pole, guiding the boat, along channels that felt different now, no less twisted, no less treacherous, but somehow less attentive. He never once saw Thibodeaux again, not that morning, not on any return journey, not in the years that followed when curiosity or guilt tugged him back toward Bayou Salem's edge just to see if anything remained. When he reported back to his superiors, the story shrank, the way all true stories do, once they hit paper. The file said there had been a confrontation with armed bootleggers, resulting in casualties and the destruction of an illegal still. It mentioned an alligator attack, framed as unfortunate but not extraordinary given the location. Remy Boudreaux's name was listed under presumed deceased. The report did not say that he had offered himself to the swamp like an old debt finally paid, and it sure as hell didn't say that for a few long hours in the middle of the night. Willis Grant had felt judged by something beyond his badge. He never spoke of the Gator and circle to Washington. He never described the way the water had felt alive beneath his boots, or the way those reptilian eyes had seemed to weigh his choices. But years later, when he was an older man with more regrets than successes, he told the story once quietly, a little drunk on a back porch to a cousin of mine who knew how to listen. He told it slow, with long pauses, like each memory still carried the weight of swamp water. And when he was done, he said something I never forgot. In the city, he told my cousin, the law decides who lives and dies. But out there, the land decides. That night I learned the difference between justice and balance. Justice is what I thought I served. Balance is what killed that old Cajun so I could walk free. I don't know which one I believe in anymore. I just know I ain't never going back to that bayou. The still rotted where it stood. Storms came and went. Water levels rose and fell. Storms tore branches loose and rearranged the channels. Hunters swore they'd seen a great old gator now and then, scarred across the snout like something had once scraped him hard. Maybe bullets. Maybe time. Some said it was Thibodeaux, grown even bigger, swimming slower now but with the same old weight in his eyes. Others said he died the night his master did, pulled down by the same invisible hand. Folks disagree about that part, but they all agree on this. Nobody builds a still in Bayou Salem anymore. Nobody sane anyway. The few who tried in the years after either vanished or crawled out half mad, talking about eyes in the water and mud that grabbed at their feet like claws. The locals learned long ago to keep their distance, to let that patch of swamp belong to itself. And when young fools ask why, old folks just shake their heads and say, that's Gator country. And rumor says it's haunted by a man who loved the bayou more than he loved his own life. So when you see a thumbnail with a big mean alligator and a moonshine still half hidden in the cypress fog, you might think it's just a story dressed up pretty for the camera. But down here in the deep south, we know better. Some tales grew out of pure imagination, sure. Others grew out of places like Bayou Salem, where the line between truth and legend is as thin and fragile as a lantern flame on swamp water and just as easy to snuff out if you don't show proper respect. And if you ever find yourself drifting too far down a Louisiana bayou on a hot, still night, and the water suddenly goes quiet, and the mud under your boat feels like it's breathing, you remember old Remy Boudreaux and that federal man who got to leave when maybe he shouldn't have. You remember that some debts get paid in court, and some get paid in mud and blood where nobody's taken notes. Then you turn that boat around, share, because the gator still might be gone, but the swamp that guarded it, that swamp is still very much alive.